G'day folks, welcome to the channel. In this video, I want to talk about the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 to 9, the Apostle Paul talks about having a thorn in his flesh, a messenger from Satan sent to buffet him and to keep him humble. He also talks about how God allowed this thorn in the flesh to remain, even though he prayed for it to go 3 times. God allowed it to remain to teach the Apostle Paul to rely upon the grace of God rather than his own strength. And so what I want to do is I want to read the passage, and then I want to look at 3 of the main interpretations that are out there of Paul's thorn in the flesh. The last one will be my personal interpretation, the interpretation that I personally hold to. So let's get right into it. Let's begin at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning at verse 7, and it says this: "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Now, the first interpretation I want to talk about is the interpretation that this thorn in the flesh is a reference to some kind of sin that the Apostle Paul had in his life. Some people say it was the sin of lust or something like that. He had this particular sin that he just couldn't overcome, and he asked God to remove it from him 3 times, but God just said, "Look, my grace is sufficient for you." I think this is the least likely interpretation. Some people point to the fact that the word infirmities later on in verse 9 is often used in the New Testament by the Apostle Paul to refer to the weakness of the sinful flesh. So this is one particular interpretation. I think it's Origen, the early church father Origen, that actually popularized this view. But as I said, I think this is the least likely interpretation for a number of reasons. First of all, there's nothing in the context that would seem to suggest that this was about some sort of besetting sin. But secondly, I think the Apostle Paul frequently talks about the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit that gives us the power to overcome sin. And I think it's very unlikely that the Apostle Paul would say that there's this sin that I just can't overcome, and so therefore I've just kind of given up and just trusted in the grace of God. I don't think that that's a likely interpretation, because the Apostle Paul, he talks about buffeting his body and bringing it into subjection, lest while proclaiming to others, he himself is cast away. So I think that's the least likely interpretation. Another interpretation is that this thorn in the flesh is some kind of physical infirmity. Some people say that he had some sort of eye problem. Maybe he had some kind of a blindness in one eye, or he had difficulty seeing or something like that. And if you go to the book of Galatians, chapter 4, verse 13 through to 15, it says this: "You know that because of physical infirmity I preached the gospel to you at first, and my trial which was in my flesh you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. What then was the blessing you enjoyed? For I bear witness that if possible you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me." And so some people will take this passage, and I think it's a reasonable argument, but they'll take this passage and they'll say, look, the Apostle Paul had some sort of physical infirmity, and that physical infirmity had something to do with his eyes, because these people were willing to gouge out their own eye and give it to him if that was possible in order to see him better. They also support this with chapter 6, verse 11, where the Apostle Paul says this at the end of the book of Galatians: "See with what large letters I have written to you with my own hand." And so some people would take this passage and they'll say, look, it's obvious the Apostle Paul had some sort of infirmity to do with his eyes. It's clear here that he had to write with big letters because he couldn't really see very clearly. And so this is the argument that they make, and they make that when they combine it with this other passage in the book of Galatians chapter 4. And I think it's a reasonable position to take. I think it's reasonable to believe that it's possible that this could be referring to some sort of infirmity in the Apostle Paul's flesh, some sort of injury of some kind, or sickness, or something like that. So that's one possible interpretation. But I personally am not convinced that that is the most likely interpretation. I think the most likely interpretation, I'm going to show you this in the context and in the passage itself, is that the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh was the Jews who were constantly slandering him, maligning him, defaming him, and causing him to be persecuted. That seems to me, in the context, to be the most likely interpretation, and I'm going to show you why. First of all, I want you to notice we read verses 7 to 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Now, if we read verse 10, I think it puts it in context for us. So let's read verse 10. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities. Some translations say weakness, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distress for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So it seems to me that the Apostle Paul's weakness here was the constant reproaches that he was facing, the persecution that he was facing, the distresses that he was facing for Christ's name's sake. And then he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Because when he relies on his own strength, that's real weakness. But when he relies on the strength of Christ, that's when he's really strong. Now, this is important because when we look at the context, you see in chapter 11, the chapter before, he's talking about the persecution of the Jews that he had been facing. So let me read this to you. And we'll talk about this term thorn in the flesh because it's actually in the Old Testament as well. It's very important to understand that that's actually symbolic of something, and we'll look at that in a moment. But I want you to look at chapter 11, the chapter before, beginning at verse 22, just so you can see the context is both before and after this statement is about his persecution and people defaming him and so forth. So let's read this, beginning at verse 22 of chapter 11. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labours more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and day I have been in the deep, in journeys often in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, and cold and nakedness, besides all the other things what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. So it seems to me that the context, both before and after this statement that the Apostle Paul makes about the thorn in the flesh, the context seems to be his affliction and the persecution that he faces, in particular, the slander and opposition from the Jews. He's constantly being slandered and maligned and persecuted by the Jews, and the Jews are stirring up other people like the Gentiles to persecute him. This is the context, and this to me seems to be the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh. Now, I mentioned that this term thorn in the flesh is talked about in the Old Testament. It's used kind of as a bit of an idiom of something in the Old Testament. So let's turn there. So this is in the book of Numbers, chapter 33, and it's verse 55. And this is when God is commanding the people of Israel to drive out the inhabitants of the land, for the land of Canaan. And he warns them, if they don't drive them out, what it's going to be like for them. And he says this. This is Numbers chapter 33, verse 55. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. So we can see here from this passage that the term thorn in your side is used in the Old Testament to refer to people that harass you. And that really seems to be the context of what the Apostle Paul is referring to here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And really what's going on here as you read this passage is that because the Apostle Paul was being used so greatly by God, and because he had received such great revelation, God allowed Satan to send these people to buffet him to keep him humble. You know, it's very difficult when you're being slandered and defamed and when people are maligning your good name. It's very difficult to endure that. You know, it humbles you. It causes you to feel like you're being shamed publicly. And I think this is very important. This is what the Apostle Paul had to endure because he was being used so mightily by God. He had to be kept humble. It also causes him to rely upon the grace of God. As it says here that he sought God and said, God, please take this thorn in my side away. He asked God 3 times, but God said, my grace is sufficient for you. For you are made perfect in weakness. And I think we need to remember this when we're in ministry. You know, the more God uses us, the more humble we need to be. Well, I hope you like this video. If you have, please consider subscribing. Give me a thumbs up. Hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comments section, and you'll see me in my next video.